Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time we're going really deep into North Korea. We're going to be talking about some of the more unusual rules and regulations in North Korea. And to help us with this, we have, well, an expert.
It's a pleasure to be here, North Korea. It's a fascinating, fascinating place.
So when we think about North Korea, what's the first thing that really comes to mind? For me, it's got to be like the Kim dynasty, right? I mean, it's not just a political leadership. It's almost like a divine right to rule over there.
Absolutely. I mean, the level of reverence for the Kim family, both past and present, it's just absolutely incredible. I mean, you walk into any home and you're going to see portraits of Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il. They're everywhere.
And they're not just pictures on the wall, are they? I mean, they're treated almost like sacred objects.
Exactly. And any disrespect towards those portraits or the Kim family in general is met with, well, pretty severe punishment.
We're not talking like a slap on the wrist here, are we?
No, not at all. We're talking serious consequences. Even something as simple as, like, falling asleep during one of Kim Jong-un's speeches.
Oh, man. I've definitely nodded off during a few boring presentations. I guess I'd be in some deep trouble over there.
You could be facing some serious jail time, or even worse. They don't mess around when it comes to showing respect for the leadership. There's actually a pretty chilling story about this. Apparently, a high-ranking official, the defense minister, was executed with an anti-aircraft gun simply for falling asleep during one of Kim Jong-un's speeches.
An anti-aircraft gun. That's intense. I mean, talk about sending a message.
Absolutely. It's about maintaining absolute control and instilling fear in the population. And it's not just about physical punishment, it's about manipulating people's thoughts and beliefs.
You know, it really makes you think, doesn't it? Like, is it genuine reverence? Or is it just fear masquerading as loyalty? It's hard to tell sometimes.
It's a complex mix for sure, but the regime certainly goes to great lengths to enforce that devotion. There's this really striking story about a mother who was imprisoned for rescuing her children from a fire instead of prioritizing the Kim portraits.
Oh, wow. I remember reading about that. It's heartbreaking.
And on the flip side, there was a farmer who was hailed as a hero for saving the portraits while his home burned down. The contrast is it's just stark.
It's a clear message. Loyalty to the Kims trumps everything, even family. It's a level of control that's hard to even fathom. But it's not just about personal beliefs, right? It extends into every aspect of life in North Korea.
Let's talk about information control. I mean, it's pretty well known that North Korea keeps a pretty tight lid on what its citizens can see, hear, and read.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, forget about K-pop, Western movies, anything like that. Even something as seemingly harmless as Squid Game is considered a dangerous influence.
Yeah, I read about that teenager who was executed for watching Squid Game. I mean, that's just crazy to me. It's a stark reminder of how far the regime is willing to go to maintain its control over information. They've created this sort of information bubble where the only narrative allowed is the one they create.
And they're not just blocking websites, right?
No.
It's much deeper than that. They've got this incredibly limited internet with only a handful of websites available to the public and making international calls. Forget about it. That's a death sentence.
Exactly. They understand that information is power, and they're not about to let that power slip away. Even things like, mimicking South Korean accents in speech or song can land you in a hard labor camp.
Wow. So even like a slight inflection in your voice can get you in trouble.
Absolutely. It's all about maintaining this image of purity, of North Korean identity. They even have, get this, government-approved hairstyles. There's a list of like 28 options, and that's it.
28 hairstyles for an entire country. That's wild.
And there are these like fashion police who patrol the streets looking for anyone wearing Western clothing. It's really incredible the level of control they exert over every detail of people's lives.
It's like living in a giant social experiment.
Uh-huh.
And let's not forget about the 3 generations punishment. That's where the family of a criminal can also be punished, sure.
Yes. It's a chillingly effective way to deter dissent. If you know that your actions could have repercussions, not just for you, but for your children and grandchildren, you're going to think twice before stepping out of line.
It's a system designed to create absolute obedience. It's
Yeah.
like this constant weight hanging over everyone's heads. But it goes beyond just thoughts and appearances, doesn't it? It affects your entire life trajectory in North Korea.
That's right. We haven't even touched on the songbun system. This is essentially a social hierarchy that dictates your place in society from the moment you're born.
So your job, your housing, your opportunities, it's all predetermined based on this songbun system. That's like a caste system for the modern age.
Exactly. And there's very little chance of moving up the ladder. You're essentially stuck in the social class you're born into, and it affects every aspect of your life.
So even something as basic as, like, traveling within the country requires government permission.
Especially for those outside of Pyongyang, the capital. They want to keep people isolated and dependent on the state. It's all about control.
And then there's this whole thing about banning certain brands, right? Particularly American ones. It seems kind of counterintuitive on the surface.
It is, but it all ties back into their ideology of self-reliance and their portrayal of the West as the enemy. By demonizing foreign goods and promoting their own, they create a sense of national pride, or at least try to.
It's like they're trying to build this wall around their people, both physically and mentally. But it's kind of hypocritical, isn't it? Because while ordinary citizens are denied access to these brands, the elite seem to have no problem indulging in Western luxuries.
Oh, absolutely. It's a classic case of do as I say, not as I do. The rules apply differently depending on your position within the hierarchy. It just speaks to this deeper issue of inequality and the concentration of power in the hands of a very select few.
So we've got this supreme leader worship, this incredibly tight control over information, and this rigid social hierarchy. It all paints a pretty grim picture, honestly. But I'm curious, like, is there any glimmer of humanity that we can glean from what we know about North Korea?
Well, it's important to remember that even in the most oppressive societies, the human spirit finds a way to endure. I came across this story about an American tourist who openly told North Koreans he was American, and instead of being met with hostility, they were actually curious.
Really? That's surprising, considering all the anti-American propaganda they're exposed to.
It is, and it suggests that despite decades of isolation and indoctrination, there's this flicker of human connection that can transcend political boundaries.
That's kind of hopeful, actually. It reminds us that even within this really controlled system, individual North Koreans are not robots. They have their own hopes and fears and dreams.
Exactly. And those are the stories that we need to keep seeking out because they're the ones that ultimately give us hope for a better future for the people of North Korea.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation so far, but I think we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack.
It really is amazing when you think about it. Like, the more you learn about North Korean society, the more you realize that control is not just like a tool they use. It's like, it's baked into everything.
Yeah, it's like this incredibly intricate web,
Hmm.
and no one can escape it. It's everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking about education earlier, and I was thinking about how it's not just about learning, right?
Exactly. It's not like they're trying to create well-rounded students or anything. It's all about ideological indoctrination. From the time they're little kids, they're taught to worship the Kim family and to fear the outside world.
I remember reading about this thing where kids are actually encouraged to report any kind of like suspicious thoughts,
Mhm.
even from their own families. It's kind of messed up when you think about it.
Yeah, that's a real thing. They basically turn kids into informants, which creates this atmosphere of fear and mistrust that permeates the entire society.
So it's like they're creating this self-policing society where everyone is watching everyone else.
Exactly. It's really effective, unfortunately. But it's not just about controlling what people think. It's also about controlling what they do in their free time.
Right, we talked about the whole media thing, but it goes way beyond that. Even simple stuff like music and books and even hairstyles are all carefully controlled by the government.
There's no room for individuality or creativity. It's all about conformity and obedience. Everything has to fit within the regime's narrow definition of what's acceptable.
It's like living in this bubble, completely cut off from the rest of the world. So like, how does all this control play out in the economy? How do people work and live in this kind of system?
Well, you can forget about, choosing your own career path or chasing your dreams. The government decides what job you'll have, where you'll live, pretty much every aspect of your economic life.
It's like a command economy taken to the extreme.
Yeah.
There's no freedom of choice at all.
Hmm.
I read about this group of college graduates who all got assigned to be potato farmers. Can you imagine that? Like, you spend years studying and then you're told you're going to be digging potatoes for the rest of your life.
It happens all the time. Your individual aspirations don't really matter in North Korea. It's all about serving the needs of the state, which usually means serving the interests of the elite.
It sounds pretty bleak, honestly. I mean, how do they even enforce all this control? Like, is it just constant surveillance everywhere?
Pretty much. There are reports of homes being bugged, phones being monitored, and even neighbors spying on each other. It creates this constant atmosphere of paranoia where people are afraid to speak their minds or do anything that might be perceived as disloyal.
So we've got control over information, control over expression, control over movement, and even control over thought itself. Like, is there anything in North Korea that's not controlled by the regime?
Well, it's certainly one of the most tightly controlled societies on Earth, but it's important to remember that everything we know about North Korea comes from a very limited number of sources.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking we have the whole picture, but we really don't.
We have glimpses, but we can't say for sure what's happening in the hearts and minds of every North Korean citizen.
It's easy to get caught up in all the negative stuff, but we can't forget that there's a human element to all this. I mean, people are still people, even in North Korea.
Exactly. And even in the most oppressive environments, there's always hope. There are stories of resilience, of people finding ways to carve out little bits of freedom and happiness for themselves.
Like little acts of defiance, little ways of holding on to their humanity.
Exactly. And those stories are really important because they remind us that change is always possible, even in a place as seemingly hopeless as North Korea.
You know, it's really mind-blowing when you think about it. Like,
Yeah.
this level of control, it doesn't just shape how people live their lives. It shapes how they see the world, how they understand reality itself.
It's true. It's almost like they've created this alternate reality inside North Korea. The Kim family are practically gods. The West is this evil enemy that's out to get them, and North Korea is this shining beacon of purity and strength.
And when that's all you know, when you have no access to any other information,
Mhm.
it's easy to see how that narrative could become your reality.
Right. It really highlights the power of information control. If you control the narrative, you control how people think. It's a pretty scary thought.
It makes you wonder how much of the support for the regime is actually real. Like, do people genuinely believe in all this? Or is it just a survival mechanism? Like, if you don't play along, you could end up in a lot of trouble.
It's hard to say for sure. I'm sure there's a mix of both. But it must be incredibly difficult to maintain any kind of objectivity when you're constantly bombarded with propaganda.
It's like living in a world where up is down and black is white. And that brings up some really interesting ethical questions, especially for the outside world. Like, what's our responsibility here? Do we try to break through that wall of propaganda and expose them to different viewpoints?
That's a tough question. I mean, on the one hand, you want to help people see the truth, to give them the freedom to think for themselves. But on the other hand, you have to be careful not to destabilize the whole system. You could end up making things worse.
Right. It's like we want to help, but we don't want to make things worse. It's a delicate balance.
It really is. And there are no easy answers. But I think the most important thing is to remember that we're talking about real people here, people with hopes and dreams and families, just like us.
Exactly. It's easy to get caught up in the politics of it all, but at the end of the day, it's about human beings, and we need to treat them with compassion and respect.
Absolutely. And I think that's the key to finding a solution, whatever that solution may be. We need to engage with North Korea, not as an enemy, but as fellow human beings.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive, but I feel like we've only just scratched at the surface. There's so much more to learn and explore about North Korea.
Here is. But hopefully, this has given our listeners a better understanding of the complexities of this country and the challenges that its people face.
And maybe it sparked some curiosity. Maybe it's made people want to learn more, to dig deeper, to challenge their own assumptions.
That would be great because the more we understand about North Korea, the better equipped we'll be to help its people create a better future for themselves.
And on that note, we'd like to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into North Korea. We encourage you to continue exploring this topic and to share your thoughts and reflections with others. It's a conversation that needs to continue.